So I'll get started now as people are joining us. Thank you all so much for coming along this morning, bright and early, after a snowy and stormy weekend. So we're here to talk about building back better, the kind of theme of the day across the UK, particularly what we can be doing in local economies across Scotland to drive an inclusive recovery. I'm really delighted to be joined by the Post Office as our partners today, so huge thanks to them for supporting this event, and also by a fantastic range of speakers from across Scottish political life, who I'll introduce you to in just a minute. So over the past few years, we know that the traditional economic model that's underpinned our towns and town centres has been shifting dramatically. We heard endless conversations even pre-pandemic about what the future of the high street, the future of our towns might look like. And now we know a lot of those challenges have been exacerbated through the COVID crisis. And that's presented both new challenges and new opportunities, as well as increased momentum behind some big and bold ideas, particularly in Scotland, ideas like the 20-minute neighbourhood and living more locally, and community wealth building that's being explored, particularly in local authorities across Scotland. And the pandemic made it clear, if it wasn't already, that we really can't afford to take local businesses and local economies for granted. This morning we'll have the opportunity to explore what actions every society, from local government to volunteer organisations, businesses and communities themselves can take to make sure that we're delivering more inclusive growth across Scotland through recovery, and that we're supporting living locally and sharing prosperity across the country. And we'll have a chance to explore how we can make sure that our communities, our high streets and local areas continue to be really key economic assets through recovery. So really looking forward to hearing from an expert panel of speakers who I'll introduce, and then we'll have a speak in a slightly different order this morning, as we're having some technical trouble joining us at this early hour. So we'll be hearing from Kate Forbes, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Economy, who needs little introduction, but Kate has been a member of the Scottish Parliament and Cabinet Secretary through the COVID crisis, and she's been the first woman to hold this post in Scotland, and perhaps also the first fluent Gaelic speaker, I was thinking this morning, with a really expert kind of perspective from local economies across Scotland, particularly given her constituency. And previous to this current cabinet role, she was Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, and leading that work across Scotland. We have Peter, who's just joined us right now. Good to have you, Peter. Who's Shadow SNP Deputy Spokesperson for the Treasury, and MP at Westminster, and has served as a member of Parliament for Glenrothes since 2015 general election. Prior to that, he was leader of Fife Council, where he'd served since 1992. And he's also served as Scottish National Party spokesperson for exiting the European Union, topical brief, and since as assistant spokesperson to the Treasury. We have Siobhan, and we've got a full panel in the room, so that's good progress. Siobhan Brown, MSP, convener of the COVID-19 Recovery Committee, and also convener of the cross-party group on towns and town centres, so an expert for this particular conversation as well. Siobhan has been MSP for Ayr since the May elections of this year, and after that she was councillor for Ayr West Ward in South Ayrshire Council. So really looking forward to hearing Siobhan's perspective from both Parliament and from her local government experience. And finally, we're delighted to be joined by Richard Taylor, who's Group Corporate Affairs and Communications Director at the Post Office, where he joined in 2020, following 4 years at Scottish Power. We're just comparing the weather in Scotland versus Yorkshire over the weekend. And he's worked on a number of initiatives that have demonstrated the importance of retail business within communities across Scotland as well. Okay. So delighted to have such an expert panel join us today, and I think we're going to go in a slightly different order, and we'll start off with 5 minutes opening remarks from each of our speakers. So I'll turn to each of you, and then we'll open up to question and answers from the audience. So please feel free to start thinking about your questions as speakers are making their opening comments, and then you'll have a chance to put those questions in the chat, and we'll turn to them later in our conversation. So I'll turn first to Siobhan to start us off this morning.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the kind invitation to attend this morning. I don't know, Rachel, if I'd take the title of an expert in town centres. I've been an elected councillor since 2017 in Ayr, and Ayr Town Centre is really on its knees. So I'm very passionate about looking at ways in which we can improve our town centres, especially now as we build back from COVID. And that's when I got elected in May. Looking at the cross-party groups, that was a number one that I did want to participate in. So yes, so we're just there. Town centres, just in the past, they have been the hubs of the community, but over the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen significant deterioration in all our town centres. And this is due to numerous reasons. Like my gran lives in a village about 3 miles out of Ayr Town. And when I used to visit from Australia as a child, she used to get on the bus every Saturday and go into Ayr Town to get her messages. And those were the days when all the town centres were really bustling and full of life. Now we fast forward 30 years and we've got large supermarkets that are opening up on the outskirts of towns. We've got retail parks, which are being created outside town centres, and it's more convenient sometimes just to drive and park in the retail centres. And then, of course, we've seen the introduction of online shopping where you don't really even need to leave your house and you can shop convenient from your couch. So ultimately, this has led to the deterioration in all our towns across Scotland and ultimately across the whole of the UK. And so many conversations that I have about getting our town centres back to the way they were. There's this huge romantic nostalgia for the good old days to return. But we all want our town centres buzzing and our local communities and businesses flourishing, but we have to be real here that those days of buzzing retail hubs are just not going to come back. And we need to look at different ways of attracting people into our town centres. I believe there's always going to be an aspect of retail to our town centres, but it's never going to be to the magnitude that probably was previously. And I think we need to look at different ways, such as reintroducing residential, because over the years, we used to have lots of flats above shops 30, 40 years ago. As the big companies moved in, they ripped out the flats and storage was put into a lot of these big buildings in our high streets, and that's specifically in Ayr, but I'm sure it has happened across all town centres in Scotland. And I also believe what we need to be looking at is introducing more leisure activities and experiences into our town centres. And also with COVID and all the international travel being disrupted, I think Scotland's got a huge history and we need to maximise potential of staycations and attract tourism as well. And by doing this, our towns can become the hubs of being the centre of the community that they were, but in a different way. All our towns were struggling prior to the pandemic, and we know we're still facing really challenging times with COVID. But I do believe that there's a genuine appetite to support each other and to rebuild our local communities after the tough times we've had in the last couple of years. I had a discussion with a local retailer in the last year, and it's been really tough for all retailers. We know this across the board in Scotland, and he's been in business for over 30 years and's got several shops in Ayr and in Ayrshire. And he made a comment to me that was really stuck with me. He was explaining the positive shift during the COVID with all the local businesses because for the past 30 years, they were all in competition. They didn't talk to each other. They were all trying to outdo each other and ignored each other. And he said, see, when COVID hit, he said, this all changed. We all started to speak together and we all started to try and help each other. And we all tried to find out how you could apply for grants. And have you done this? Have you tried that? And he just said it was just a totally different feeling between all the local businesses. So even under the huge dark cloud of COVID, I think there is a positive silver lining that we need to build on locally between these businesses. And I do think there's a real drive and a spirit that the communities do want to build back in a different way. But to do this, communities and businesses and local authorities all need to pull together to make this happen. And one of the key factors, I believe, to drive this forward is that we all need to start to support our local businesses more. If we spend local, we increase jobs, we decrease the carbon footprint, we stimulate our local economies. And I know that you touched, Rachel, on the community wealth building in the introduction. Across the 3 local authorities in Ayrshire and North, East and South, there currently is a 3 million pilot scheme for community wealth building. This is where the local authorities work in partnership with communities and local businesses to build a strong local economy and to work collaboratively together and to reevaluate the goods we buy, the people we employ, and look at the collective spend. And so it's all about using the money we already do spend, but spend it in a way which is better and supports our local economy. Community wealth building was trialled in Preston in England in 2011 and worked quite successfully. They made a concerted effort to focus on procurement and spend locally in Preston, and the annual local spend went from 38.3 million to 4 years later 112.3 million locally. So community wealth building is an initiative that can start to have a positive impact quite quickly locally. Longer term, with the right infrastructure in place, I think the 20-minute neighbourhoods is a positive step moving forward. This is where we have the urban development that creates neighbourhoods which services can be accessed within a 20-minute walk. This includes shopping, recreation, leisure activities, schools and local services such as health and GP practices. And that can also tie quite easily in with community wealth building. Obviously, everyone here today at the SNP Conference, we all believe that Scotland can thrive and prosper as an independent country. But I do believe at the moment, with powers being taken away by Westminster, such as the Levelling Up Fund, there's different projects which the Westminster government might fund in Scotland that might not tie up with Scotland's long-term plan. So I see that as a little bit of an obstacle until we gain our full independence. But just in conclusion, times have been tough, and they might be tough for several years, but we just need to move forward, and we need to build stronger local communities and rebuild for our future generations.
Thanks so much, Siobhan, for a really excellent opening set of remarks. We'll go next to Richard from the Post Office. Thanks very much, Richard.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everybody. Just a couple of reflections from me, and just looking at the title on the screen there in terms of how local economies can drive an inclusive recovery. And I think that is the opportunity which we have if we think a little bit differently about our communities, our town centres, as Siobhan's been describing, and in particular, maybe think about it from what I would describe as both the sort of seen and the unseen. So what do I mean by that? So there's the seen benefits. So let's think about our high streets, and certainly from the perspective of Post Office, one advantage which we have as the largest retailer in the country is that we are in every community. So whether that's in Ayr or Glenrothes or all across the Isle of Skye, we're there in different forms, and that does provide opportunities to bring some footfall and some custom. And some research we did last year shows that 1 in 3 people, when they come and visit a post office, will then go and visit another shop next door or a cafe. So it's an economic multiplier, it's a catalyst, it's a true sort of anchor of the high street, if you like. So there is that opportunity, and it helps increase that revenue in a way in which Siobhan was describing in terms of Preston, for example, in England, as to how they think about ways in which they catalyse their high streets. But also, as we think about inclusive recovery, recognising that for some people they've perhaps been on furlough or perhaps even been made redundant, that if they're looking to maybe generate their own economic activity, start a business, a micro business, you can do that anywhere, as long as you have 2 things really: an internet connection, and I know that's not always easy, but if you can get an internet connection and you've got access to a post office, then you can send goods and products all over the world, and you can do all of your cash and banking. And certainly, again, when we've spoken to small businesses, we know that over 40% would struggle not to function without access to post offices. But I think that opportunity to have that kind of inclusive recovery, I think that is one thought as we think about ways in which people are readjusting their lives and thinking about living differently, as to what are those opportunities to be able to maybe work nearer to where you live in a different way and not have to rely on that commute, and therefore maybe to focus on your local economy. One further topic I'd just like to raise, and maybe we'll come back to it in the discussion, and that's just around the importance of cash. Because if you're going to have an economy, you need some money, and that money needs to circulate. And traditionally, that was cash. Now, clearly, we live in a modern digital age, and for many people, the ability now to wave your debit or credit card and spend £100 like that, for some people, that's fine. For many, it isn't. And cash is a really important driver of our economics in our town centres. When we talk about cash, we often think about access to cash, the ability to be able to get it out. But I'm particularly just want to raise it in the context of, again, small businesses and the importance of being able to take that cash and also to be able to deposit it. So with banks closing, if you're running a small business, the problem is that you don't necessarily want to then have to take your cash, maybe drive 20 minutes, half an hour or so to go to a bank in order to deposit that. And so one of the things which we may want to discuss is what are those opportunities, and maybe talk a little bit more about something we're experimenting with in Campbell's Lang in Lanarkshire in terms of developing what would look like a bank, but isn't, because it's what we call a bank hub. So maybe that's something which we can think about, because if I just have a look at the size of cash deposits in Scotland at the moment. So we run a little tracker, but just to give you one last statistic. So if I look at October just gone, about £55 million of cash was withdrawn from post offices in October last month, but 3 times as much was deposited. Okay, so if you just think about that in terms of, and that's because if you're going to deposit cash, if there's not a bank to go and do it, then you are going to come and do that in a post office. So we've got 3 times as much deposits coming in as we have withdrawals. And half of those deposits are from businesses. These are businesses who desperately need to not only be able to receive that cash, but to deposit it. And that's going to be quite critical for sustaining our local economies and helping them recover. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Richard, and definitely be returning both to cash and the kind of cash ecosystems that the post office plays a really integral role in, and also to the role of local post offices. My own granny was worked in the post office in Calacan on the Isle of Skye for most of her life, so definitely attest to that. The importance of them as kind of local community institutions as well. I'll turn next to Peter. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Good morning, everybody, and apologies for holding things up with the technical problems earlier on. I think, Rachel, you described me in the introduction as still being the Brexit spokesperson at Westminster. I'm not anymore. I would say thankfully, not because it wasn't fascinating and interesting, but because there's only 24 hours in the day. And certainly Philippa Whitford is doing a fantastic job in that role. I want to start by suggesting that there's a lot of keywords in the brief that we get sent around, even in the title of today's talk. We need to continually ask ourselves what we think they mean. What does recovery actually mean? What does inclusive mean? What do we mean by growth? And is economic growth always the single best way to judge whether or not we're being successful? Even what do we mean by a community? We tend to assume that by a community we mean a geographical community of people who live close together. But people's lives are built around all sorts of different communities of people that they work beside, sometimes people that they share some kind of ethnicity with, share leisure interests with. So when we talk about working with communities, we need to recognise that there can be a very strong community spirit among a group of people who don't live particularly close to each other. So all those questions that I've asked, there's no right answers to any of them. There's wrong answers to most of them. And I think what we've seen in the way we've tried to support town centres and we've tried to support struggling communities over the last 50, 60 years shows that if we keep giving the same answers to the same questions, we're going to keep getting the same problems. If you look at the areas that would have been identified in the late 60s, early 70s as priority areas for support with urban aid programmes, as they're called then, and look at the urban areas across Scotland that we would all agree need particular support just now, it's pretty much the same areas. There's 1 or 2 exceptions, but the parts of my constituency that need support today are almost exactly the same parts that needed the support 50 years ago. And that tells me that the way that we've tried to support communities in the past, although it's been well intentioned, far too often we've just done the same thing with a different name or a different logo, and it hasn't worked. So the first thing that we've got to have the courage to do is to think outside the box, think about doing things that have never been attempted before. Because if we keep doing the same as we've always done, we'll keep getting what we've always got. And that means that we'll have an economy that fails possibly as many as 50% of our population. Certainly at least 1 million people in Scotland just now are being failed by the economy, and we just can't allow that to continue. When we talk about recovery, what is it we're trying to recover to? We all know only too well what we're trying to recover from. The position that we're in now, we're trying to get away from. But do we want to recover back to where things were before we'd ever heard of COVID? And I think Siobhan mentioned that in her comments as well. And I think the answer is no, we don't. We don't want to go back to the level of aeroplane flights or single-use car journeys that we had before. I don't think we want to go back to an economy that relies on huge numbers of people spending 2 or 3 working days per week just getting to the work, and sometimes spending a big chunk of the net pay just getting to work. I don't think that's a healthy economy either. So what is it we need to do to not only to regenerate and re-enliven towns and villages where the local economy has been severely damaged, but even the big cities? What is it we want the economy in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh to look like in 5 years' time? And if all we do is get it back to what it was before COVID, then I think we've missed an opportunity. So simply throwing money at the problem is not going to work, but there's no doubt at all that there needs to be significant investment in a lot of our towns and villages. It needs to happen soon. Some of it has got to come from the public sector, but some of it has also got to come from the private sector. I'll throw in a few issues that I think need to be looked at, and we could run a 2-hour session on any of these. I've spoken, I suppose, about what you might call localisation of work. We need to use the planning system to provide as many employment opportunities and as many varied employment opportunities as possible for people without having to travel excessive distances. I think both previous speakers have mentioned the need for good broadband connectivity, absolutely crucial. And again, part of that has to be publicly funded. Part of it is going to be privately funded because the market works in densely populated areas. I think we have to plan for a world where there's a lot more home working and people work much more flexible hours. Think about the implication that has for the planning of our public transport system. Massive implications that we can't afford to hide from them. The planning system itself, I think, needs a bit of an overhaul. It's good at some of the things it does. I don't think it's powerful enough just now to encourage good developments to happen. It's good at stopping bad developments, but we don't yet have a way of really pushing the positive developments that people want to see. Land ownership is eventually going to have to be looked at, especially the issue of land banking, for either house builders or supermarkets just buy land not to do anything with, but to keep out the competition. We need to be looking at legislation to control that. And finally, I don't think anybody thinks that our system of business taxation is fit for purpose. We're very, very limited as to what we can do just now, but with the powers of independence, I think we need to really have a close look at that. How do we get the balance between local and national business taxation? I think if we give local communities, local authorities more say in how their businesses are taxed, they're then able to use that tax system to encourage the kinds of businesses that they want to see. So I've asked a lot of questions there. I haven't necessarily given very many answers, but I think that's the way this discussion has to be for the next few while. The single thing that I would say we've got to be prepared to do is we've got to be bold with this. It's dead easy just to try and get things back to the way they were before. There's nobody in the SNP that thinks things are working just now. That's why we're in the SNP. That's why we want independence. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, for a really excellent set of questions that I'm sure we'll have a chance to explore further through this morning. And finally, I'll turn to Kate for your comments.
Thanks very much, and good morning from a very cold and still quite snowy Dingwall, one of the many local economies that really matter to me. And I just starting with a comment Richard made about how important it is that we are tailoring our initiatives, our interventions, our support to each different local economy. So the challenges that face, for example, Wick are very different from what might face Leith. And
I wanted to talk just a little bit. I think the other speakers have set out really well some of the challenges and also the imperatives, the need for action. And I wanted to speak a little bit to what government can and can't do. And all of this is really about how we empower local communities to take advantage of local assets to ensure that their local economy is thriving. And, one of the challenges with that word empower is that usually on paper, it looks like financial support, legislation, it changes to rules and regulations. But on the ground, it nearly always boils down to a well organized group of individuals or households or businesses who are committed to improving their local community and their local economy. And that nearly always requires grit and determination to be successful. On Friday, I was in a local community that may not look like one of your conventional high streets. It was the community of Morven at the bottom of the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. And they have recently invested in a hydro scheme using the local natural resources, the wealth of natural resources, to build a hydro scheme that can power up to 2,000 households. And at the same time, they invested in a new community hub and 3 new affordable homes. The new community hub is a cafe and a craft sales place, immediately creating work for the chef, for the waiters and waitresses, as well as for the local people that are involved with arts and crafts. The 3 affordable homes have been brought in new families, including one local new teacher. So the point I'm trying to make is that all of us, every single part of Scotland, has a great wealth of talent and resources. Of that, there is no doubt. That is shared equally across the country. What isn't shared equally across the country is the ability to access that and build a thriving local economy on that. And I wanted to talk just to a few examples where we are trying to help communities unlock the potential of that natural talent and those natural resources in the local area to turn it into a thriving economy. Because I agree with Peter, things are not working well right now, and we want to see those change. And I think nearly always we go to 1 or 2 things that we think will make a big difference, not realizing that actually what you need is far more important than that. You need to free people up and empower people to be the best entrepreneurs they can be, to be the best community resilience builders that they can be. So one of the initiatives that was front and center of the manifesto back in May was community wealth building. And in our recently published COVID recovery strategy, we pledged to support all 32 local authorities. So in other words, right across Scotland, over the next 18 months to develop their own community wealth building plan. And that goes alongside our commitment to develop a community wealth building bill during this Parliament to consolidate all the changes in practice and enable local anchor organisations. They could be local authorities, they could be health boards, they could be other organisations to use their economic leverage to deliver more for local people and for communities. And it's trying to basically use public money through procurement or other means to create new work opportunities, to help local businesses, to help co-ops to expand and to place more assets in the hands of local people and communities. In Morven, that might mean a hydro scheme. In Leith, that might mean a building. Somewhere else, that might mean something totally different. And there's some really good examples, because we have been working across Ayrshire with the £3 million to advance the community wealth building initiatives across Ayrshire. And we're also working with the Clyde Mission to support projects. We want to learn to see what's working and what isn't working, and then to build on that. In a sense, community wealth building is trying to bring all the best practice we have of investing in local economies, of empowering local communities and supporting local businesses, and bringing it all together under one banner. This notion that resilience for communities means putting them in charge of their destination and of their destiny by empowering them, giving them the resources that they need to run with that. And so that was really the only, there's a lot of other initiatives that I could talk to. I could talk to the work we're doing around 20-minute neighbourhoods, how we're trying to make better use of vacant and derelict land, the town centre action plan, the local food strategy, etc., National Islands Plan. But I think all of that kind of sits alongside this central theme of empowering local communities through community wealth building. And that's not to say that you just leave it to local communities and the public sector takes a step back. In fact, it's about the public sector being accountable to local communities and working with them as they drive the show and as they take ownership of local assets. Last point I make, and then I will stop talking because I see there's questions coming in, is that when it comes to community empowerment, I often see it as a triangle where you've got the legislation, take the Community Wealth Building Bill, you've got the funding, let's take the land fund. But what you need absolutely for any of that to be successful are people. Our local businesses, local households, local individuals, the people that sit on our community councils, the people that sit on local trusts, the people who are working tirelessly day in, day out, facing down some of the grief and the challenge to deliver a project to completion. And it's a tough slog and it's a tough gig. And ultimately, they are the ones right now across Scotland that are determining the future of their local communities and their local economies. We can make it easier or harder for them by either helping them or hindering them. And too often, I think we still make it harder for them rather than helping them. And I include all of the public sector and a lot of the big organisations and enterprises in the private sector in that. So that I think is our job to wrap round the work that they are already doing to create local thriving economies. And our national economy is never going to thrive until and unless each part of Scotland is thriving. And that means focusing specifically on areas that have been historically perhaps felt left behind and haven't seen the level of job creation that other places have seen. So I'll stop there, Rachel, but I'm sure lots of the questions will get into other details. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kate, and to all our speakers for a really excellent and thought-provoking set of opening comments. I thought I'd start with a fairly big question, and then people have already started scribbling away in the chat, so please do keep your questions coming in, and we'll turn to them in just a moment. I think a theme across all of what we've heard today, as you put it, Kate, is empowerment, or the kind of shifts in power that we need to see to enable local communities to actually drive change that suits their lives, their priorities, their local area, rather than having a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. As we've discussed, is never going to work for the vast array of different economies we see at the local level across Scotland. How do you see this kind of shift in power working? Where are the kind of examples that we can draw on from across Scotland? I think we've heard some examples already this morning from the community wealth building initiatives across Ayrshire to land ownership, to the kind of community ownership conversations that have started across Scotland. I wonder if we can kind of draw out some of those examples where there's obvious kind of areas to learn from, either from long-term projects like regeneration initiatives to some of the newer kind of thinking that's just getting off the ground. I thought I'd turn first to Siobhan on that one and speak a little bit more to the work that's being done in Ayrshire.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, well, the pilots really just happened in the last 2 years, and it's really in the early stages. But I think if we do look at the models, as I previously said, with Preston over the 4-year, there was significant change in local spend, which can impact the town centres. So I do think that there's models that we can look at, but I do think we're in this fluid situation where, as Peter said previously, I don't think we want to return back to the way things were pre-COVID. So we need to move forward. And I think at the moment, I can't really think of anything off the top of my head of an initiative locally that has been hugely successful. I think there's a lot of exciting plans in place, and I think this is why I'm specifically talking about Ayrshire at the moment, is that we do see our town centres the way they are at the moment, because I don't think there has been a long-term vision or plan in light of online shopping and everything for the last 20, 30 years. And this is where we really have to catch up and move forward.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I thought I'd turn to you next, Richard, particularly on the kind of the thread of thought that we almost touched on earlier around community banking hubs and the kind of work you're doing at the post office to support the kind of infrastructure that the local communities need to build back better.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rachel. There are many different types of post offices. People will be aware from their own experience, where whatever their local one looks like, whether that's maybe a mobile van or in a rural community, or one in a convenience store. So to Kate's point, it's very mixed, and we have to get the solutions right for each community. One of the issues which we face is ensuring, as we were talking about earlier, that people can come and fulfill those essential services. This is about being not only able to post a letter or send a parcel, but to be able to increasingly access cash and to fulfill basic banking services. And that specific example, which we mentioned, was in Cambuslang in Lanarkshire, so just to the south of Glasgow, and where all the banks had left that high street, and that community was suffering. So we've been experimenting with what's called a bank hub. So it looks and feels like a bank run by the post office. You can come in and pay in a check or get cash out any day of the week. What's different about it is that there is a consultation room, as you'd expect to find in a bank, where you can have a confidential discussion, and you'll find Barclays are there on a Monday and HSBC there on Tuesday, Santander on Wednesday, and so on. And that just provides an opportunity for people to conduct wider banking. And most important thing, again, is that for Cambuslang, talking to community leaders there, I visited it last month, I think it was, it's really helped with sustaining the local high street and the local economy. So to the point I made earlier, whereby business owners were previously having to take their cash to the centre of Glasgow to go to a bank, they can now do that in a way which is much more confidently locally on their high street. And that has a significant benefit for those shops, those retailers, to be able to continue to open longer hours, for example, because they're not having to close early to get cash up, but also just have that confidence to be part of that community. So certainly one thing to consider as we think about that mix of right solutions for right communities, recognising that they will be different across Scotland.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Richard. And Peter, I turn to you just on some of the comments you made around what there is to learn from different approaches. Obviously, we've always been interested in the question of thriving local economies across Scotland, and what are the kind of lessons as you see them from how different approaches have worked out or not worked out as well in the past, and what would you like to be seen taken forward through this economic recovery?
Yeah, I mean, one example that is so obvious we maybe haven't thought of it, of something that has worked very well, is community land ownership. When I was I've been over to the Isle of Gia a couple of times. The first time it was over just a year or so after the community bought over the island. And one of the first things they did once they owned it was they put 3 wind turbines out at the top of the hill. Now, with the old-fashioned way of doing it, if the laird or an absentee landowner had decided they were going to build 3 wind turbines in the top of Gia, there would have been a riot about it. People just wouldn't have accepted it. But because it was their island, it was their decision, they understood the importance of a secure energy supply for everything they wanted to achieve, and they were going to control how the electricity was used and who it was used for. It completely turned that argument on its head. And I'm very attracted by a lot of the comments that Leslie Riddick, for example, makes about community land ownership, when she compares the model of land ownership we have here to what happens in Norway, for example, where it's just assumed that the local community own the land that the community is built on. So if there's going to be a small hydroelectric station built on the burn, the people will decide what they want to do. They will build the station, they will own it, and they'll also own the electricity that comes out of it. So that power station gets built for the purpose of providing electricity to people in the village and the community, rather than it being plonked on them by an absentee company with shareholders in the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands, where the electricity is then sent down south to power the offices of yet another absentee investment bank. So there are things that we can start to do around land ownership, which makes a huge big difference. And I think you talk about ownership of land, but if people have got given the chance to own the land that the community's on, they then take ownership of everything else as well. They take ownership of the problems and they come up with solutions that are right for their problems that maybe wouldn't work anywhere else. It's probably about rebalancing, and it needs to be significantly rebalanced. Rebalancing where the decision-making authority lies, from right down to the smallest community, whether it's a community council or some other body, all the way up through local government, central government, and at the moment the UK government. Again, just now we're limited as to how far we can push it, because we've got a UK government who are quite prepared to tear up devolution and take everything back into their own hands if they don't like the way that things are going in Scotland. And I think one of the things they will try to do is to stop us doing anything that's too successful, because they don't want us to demonstrate that doing things a different way from the way Britain's been doing things for the last 400 years, that you can actually be more successful by doing something different.
Thanks very much, Peter. And then I'll turn to Kate. You mentioned the kind of learning from what works and the kind of lessons that might be taken, and not kind of transplanted, but kind of translated into different local economies across Scotland. I wondered where you thought those kind of important examples that we might learn from were coming from.
Yeah, so I think there's very different and distinct examples right across Scotland, everywhere you look. For some communities, it's about acquiring land, particularly in rural areas where, for example, they are landlocked. In other words, there's no access to land for anything. So in a time where there's quite a lot of tourism, which should be a positive thing, they can't develop car parks and they can't develop opportunities. Then there's other examples where they have taken a problem and turned it into a resolution. And nearly always there are strange alliances. So this is why I don't think I'm very nervous about ideological assumptions about one thing automatically being good and another thing automatically being bad. So if we take Skye, for example, there are areas in Skye that have seen huge amounts of tourism, and they've partnered with charities. And that means that the charity receives some of the revenue as well as the community. There's other areas that are almost purists, where they think it has to be the community and only the community. So if you take the fairy pools in Skye, lots of traffic. They've now developed car parking, toilet facilities. They're charging for it. The first sort of amount of revenue has gone into buying a village bus. And, suddenly the older folks can get out and about. But they were only able to do that by working closely with a charity. And there's other areas in Skye, other areas that I know of where saying, well, that's ridiculous because the charity is getting a slice of the funding. But that worked for that community. There's other communities where they've got paid development officers that can develop these things. And in some areas, it's literally about developing sports facilities. In other areas, it's about trying to right a wrong of a land owner. And still others, controversially, is about working well with a landowner, where you've got a progressive, positive landowner. Just last week in Aviemore, I was visiting about 6 new homes that have been built in collaboration with a local landowner who, has basically given the land to ensure that the housing is affordable. And, he in a sense, he still owns the estate around it, but he has been able to make those houses happen because of a different approach. So for me, it's all about outcomes rather than necessarily how you get there. And the key is communities realizing they can do it. And quite often I have very, very early conversations with people that say, we've got a major economic problem. So maybe it's depopulation, maybe it's poverty and deprivation, maybe it's a lack of housing or a lack of business hubs or a lack of something that is directly hindering economic development, and they don't know how to solve it. And so we go through the different options of what might take to solve it, and then bring in the various public bodies that can help solve that. Sometimes those are public sector organizations, sometimes they're in the private sector, because it's the private sector that could make or break this. So I guess that's a lot of waffle to say it's got to be tailored to the specific context. One area that we haven't solved in this conversation yet, because I've kind of taken it into a community, and as has Siobhan taken it into an area of sort of community empowerment, but our high streets. And I think the big danger is that we try and apply old models to salvaging what's going wrong right now. And it just isn't going to work. You know, we right now across Scotland on non-domestic rates, for example, have some of the most generous reliefs anywhere in the country. You know, nowhere else in the UK do businesses not pay reliefs under sort of 15k of rateable value. The caps are much lower elsewhere in the UK, but still our high streets are struggling. So for anyone who says, if you just provide more reliefs, you'll fix it, it's whole systems that need to change, not just tinkering around the edges. And I think a vision for our high streets in particular has to completely transform rather than just try and salvage what we have according to old models.
Thanks very much, Kate. We've got a couple of questions coming from the chat. So we've got a question about how we kind of manage the tensions between increased residency in town centres and urban areas, and the urgency of the climate crisis, and particularly asking about electric vehicle charging points, home heating conversion, those kind of local areas. So I'll go to Siobhan first on that one, and then a second questions, we'll take them together, on adjusting the urban landscape. So I suppose kind of picking up on your points, Kate, around High Street in particular, and what powers there are within Scottish Government. I know you've just mentioned them, particularly around business rates, but around planning was other things being raised in the chat. What could we do to kind of build a more sustainable future for our urban landscape or our high streets, either way you want to put it. I'll go first to you, Siobhan.
Thanks, Rachel. I just really wanted to touch on the point about the electrical vehicle charging, because it is an issue that's brought up with me, a constituency issue as an MSP quite often. And I do believe we need significant government investment is going to be crucial if we're going to achieve our targets regarding electrical vehicle the change to electric vehicle cars. My brother lives in Holland, and the Netherlands have been very proactive since 2012 in encouraging electric vehicles, and the government has subsidized quite significantly households to all get their charging points. And so far, I think there's 75,000 that are leading in Europe, Holland, and 190,000 households have got electrical vehicle charging points, which is significant. And they're really leading the way because they need to achieve their targets, and they've been very proactive. So just going back to the question, I just think what we need to do is look at models that other countries are doing and try and follow pack. But we really need to make a move on the electrical vehicles and giving reliable charging points, because I find that's an issue locally at the moment as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I wondered, Peter, if you wanted to come in on either of those questions.
Yeah, I think the question about the tension around get more people moved back into living in the town centres, and then that creates problems for the zone. The point is very well made in the question, and I think it demonstrates that although we can start pushing for a particular direction of travel that gives us a better result than we had before, it's not going to be perfect. And it doesn't mean that there's going to be an immediately obvious, easy and universally popular answer to any particular question. But Graham's question mentioned what do you do when you want to start upgrading old heating systems? Time for a wee plug for Glenrothes and Centre 5 constituency, because just along the coast from me at Methil, is probably going to be the first place in the world to have a full-scale use of hydrogen gas to heat people's homes, and possibly after that to start to power some of the local businesses. The advantage of that is that there do need to be adaptations made to some appliances and so on, but it doesn't need a complete replacement of all the pipework for example. So if you've got ordinary methane gas just now, it's not as complicated as you might think to make your entire system within your house compatible with hydrogen gas. Now, the production of hydrogen gas itself isn't particularly easy, and it's not particularly cheap, but the great advantage is that when you burn it, you get water, so it's completely carbon free. So I think that's one example where technological advances that are happening right now in Scotland, and the gas pilot is being supported substantially by the Scottish Government and by the UK Government, is a good example of using public investment to drive technological change that, it will make a profit for Scottish Gas Networks and various other people at the end of the day, but it's also got the potential to deliver significant benefits for maybe not quite everybody in the country, but for pretty close to everybody in the country. That's the kind of things we need to be doing. I think Kate mentioned that we need to lose any kind of ideological absolutism. There's times when letting somebody make a profit from something, and there might be times when letting somebody make a big profit from something is the right thing to do if the wider community can benefit from it as well.
Thanks very much, Peter. I thought I'd look to the future a little bit with the final question. We talked at the start of this morning's session about the way our lives are going to be lived very differently as a result of the pandemic and through whatever kind of speed of recovery we see, and particularly the shift towards home working, which we know isn't everybody's experience, but we know is a kind of really significant shift for local economies. How do you think these kind of different ways of working in the future, different ways of living and living more locally potentially, what do you see as the kind of key opportunities there? How can we get to a kind of 20-minute neighbourhood as an idea that's being explored across Scottish Government at the moment? What are the kind of big shifts you think we need to see to make that happen? And I'll go first, I think, to you, Richard, if that's okay.
Well, I think I've already made quite a good plug for those on the basis that plugging the post office as a key facilitator of that, because actually if you're going to want to be able to enjoy that 20-minute neighbourhood, to be able to walk or cycle to your local community and transact, then we're well placed to do that and to help you live your lives, whether that's for your personal social life or for indeed working life and business life. And I was just looking at Andy's comments in the chat as well, just thinking around and back to Kate as well on what else can we do as part of that, just to recognise that individual businesses, they have to be profitable in their own right. And again, most post offices these days are run by entrepreneurs who are running some other aspect of a retail offer. They're running a convenience store. Hopefully they're not all just stacking it high and selling it cheap, Andy, but are making sure that they're providing that access for people with disabilities and so on. But they need to be profitable in the round. And one of the things that we have to work at quite hard is to ensure that, for example, they want to have a post office in their shop, rather than going, actually, I could use that space for a food to go counter or a Costa coffee machine or something like that. And this is where rateable values come back in. One bit of tinkering you could still do, Kate, is remove separate rateable values on ATMs. So if you're a postmaster and you've got an ATM, you have to pay rates twice. And these things just can be a hindrance. But anyway, I thought I'd just stick that one in there as well. But 20-minute neighbourhoods are great, and we'd love to help out with more of them. Thank you.
Great. And that's an IPPR recommendation as well. So a second plug. Promise this isn't a takeover. From some work we did on the role of the decline of cash, as you touched on at the beginning. I'll turn to you, Kate, and then I'll give everybody a chance to kind of wrap up with some brief closing comments. So just to give you a heads up that we'll turn to that next.
Yeah, so we've just published the National Planning Framework 4 document out for consultation right now. And I think too often planning is seen as a series of hoops you have to jump through for your own specific development, rather than what it really should be seen as, which is a way of genuinely planning in advance the way that we are going to live and work and play. And, something like 20-minute neighbourhoods doesn't just happen automatically. It has to be planned out. And we are changing the way that we live and work. Take my life, for example. I used to be on the road permanently. And during COVID, during lockdown and beyond, I've spent far more time working from home than I would ever have done. I have surgeries, not all surgeries, but a lot of surgeries by Zoom. And everybody will have a similar story to tell, unless you're doing a job that requires that face-to-face contact, particularly on the front line of the public and the private sector. But people want to be able to work more closely. And again, I hate to keep using one example, but the village of Lochaline is about 2 hours drive from Fort William, and that is about 3 hours drive from Glasgow, which is however many hours drive from London. And during lockdown, a lot of people, and there's a different argument here about second homes and all the rest of it, but just ignore that for a moment. A lot of people chose to work from Lochaline, and they are now looking at building a hub of offices where people can choose to leave the house and work locally. So they might be working for international clients, but they're working in an area that has long suffered from depopulation, and they're building. And that's the kind of thing intentionally. So there's two things I'm saying. One is planning it proactively, and the second is reacting to the way that people are now living and working. And those are the two ways in which I think we implement the 20-minute neighbourhood. People are making it happen where they can. Where they aren't, we need to step in and try and help. And the National Planning Framework kind of outlines all that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Kate. I'll go first to you, Siobhan, for some brief closing comments.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I think it's been a really beneficial discussion today. Just one little point that I would like to just comment on from your last question to some of the panels was the home working aspect. And even though close to 2 years ago, we were thrown into working from home and home learning, online working, and it has huge advantages for the carbon footprint. As Kate was saying, you can have online surgeries, but I'm a little bit hesitant, I have to say, regarding us moving forward with having home working as the majority. And I'll tell you why, because I in the last 2 years also as a councillor, I know when we went into lockdown, we've got 4,000 employees at South Ayrshire Council, so 2,000 of them started to work at home. And of course, it was during the time where we had all the grants and all the businesses were concerned. So the grants were announced by the Scottish Government, and we had individuals at home taking a telephone call after call after call from local businesses, very angry people wanting to know about their funding. And it's a social, the mental health impact on the council employees at the time being at home, because when you're in a working environment, you can get off the phone and you can vet someone. But if you're sitting at home constantly, call after call after call, it has had a detrimental impact on the council's workforce, because we've got a lot of people off now with mental health issues. And I'm also thinking, I've got a 17-year-old daughter who will be leaving school next year and either going to college or going into the workforce. And also got people starting new jobs just working from home. And when I remember when I left school and I went to my first job, like, it's just a brand new experience. There's so much valuable information and you learn so much and new social interaction. And I just have real concerns as we move forward, given there isn't a flexibility between home working and real working, and the social environment that brings and all the knowledge. So there has to be a balance moving forward. That's just what I'd like to say as my closing comments.
Thanks very much, Ron. A really useful reminder. I'll go to Peter, then Richard, then Kate, but I won't come in between, just to save us a little bit of time as we wrap up.
Thanks, Rachel. Siobhan's made an important point there, that the benefits of home working are there for everybody to see. If you take it too far, then the benefits start to turn into significant disadvantages. And the same applies to a lot of the changes we could be seeing. What percentage of retail trade now is done online? I don't know what it is, but it's a lot higher than it was 3 or 4 years ago. That's got its advantages in terms of convenience. The disadvantage is that it kills off town centres as retail locations. It's probably going to start to kill off the big out-of-town shopping centres as well. And for both online shopping and online working, you lose the social aspect of it, which is vitally important. So that we do need to have a balance. We need to make sure that If our town centres are not going to be the main place that people go for their shopping, there needs to be another reason for them to go there. And we need to make sure that there's something that will attract people into town centres. That's where people meet, that's where they keep up social contacts. Yeah. I think the final point that I would make is that we've quite rightly said quite a lot about how limited the Scottish Government is just now and what it's able to do. We shouldn't expect this problem to be fixed as part of the United Kingdom, because the time it's going to take us to really build back towards the economy that we want to recover from COVID is going to take longer than we expect the next referendum to be. And that's something I think I find quite exciting, because it means that the limitations that are put on us just now by being part of the United Kingdom, I don't think they're going to be in place when we get part of the way down the road to building back our town centres and then we want them. So we will have the opportunity before this journey is finished to have a government that isn't limited in what it can do with its planning policy, with its taxation policy, with anything else. And out of everything that we've spoken about today, that's a part of it that makes me feel most optimistic.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Rachel. I'll finish where I started, which is about the unseen and the seen. And I think Kate articulated it very well. There's actually lots of new opportunities for unseen recovery, which can also be very inclusive. But I think we should remember that the seen benefits of a high street, the communities, getting the two right together will be is the holy grail, isn't it? To get that there is community presence, so there's somewhere where you can go, and there is economic life which people give vibrancy to their communities. But let's really explore as well the opportunity of that unseen economy for inclusive recovery. Thank you.
Thanks. I am also optimistic. I think we've got the infrastructure in place when it comes to enabling communities to thrive, but we have to have a single sort of focus and absolute persistence and resilience to try and identify economic opportunities in all parts of Scotland that directly benefit local residents and local communities and create jobs, rather than sort of stripping local areas of their economic assets and exporting it. So I think we've got the infrastructure in place, but it really needs to, it's all about delivery right now.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Thanks to our excellent expert panel. Thanks very much for our partners at the Post Office. And thank you all very much for taking the time to join us this morning for what's been a really fascinating conversation. Hope we'll continue in lots of different places. Thanks very much for your time and have a lovely day.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.